So we're going to start the final panel, and we just realized we don't have a moderator. And I'm the filler, so... we're going to have 3 speakers on this panel, and each is going to have up to 15 minutes to provide their thoughts, reflections on the proceedings of today and yesterday night. We're going to start with Johanna, then Professor Hovannisian, and Massimo Pigliucci afterwards. So, Johanna Vollhardt.
Alright, so my name is Johanna Vollhardt. I'm a assistant professor of psychology here at Prague University. I'm affiliated with the Strassler Center. So I am going to put in a plug for my disciplinary perspective of psychology, because I heard several disciplinary plugs for political science, anthropology, and of course the historians dominate this anyway.
That mic a little closer. It might make it clear for somebody like me.
Okay, sorry. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychological perspective on these issues, because, to be honest, when I looked at the program and the speakers, I was surprised not to find a psychologist on the panels, given how much psychology is involved in the issue of denial and acknowledgement. And this was mentioned by several speakers in other disciplines, implicitly or explicitly, but maybe we can talk a little bit more explicitly about some of the underlying psychology of these topics. Because basically, of course, psychologists have a lot to say about the mechanisms of denial, or what enables people to engage in denial, and especially those forms of denial that are not just strategic, where we know the truth, as the speaker on the tobacco industry said, but more specifically those cases of denial that are kind of more like a knee-jerk reaction coming from our identification as group members, for example, or other political interests. So psychologists have been studying some issues related to, for example, moral disengagement. If you're interested in this topic, Albert Bandura developed an explicit kind of typology of a few different mechanisms that enable people to engage in denial on issues where, basically mechanisms that allow us to deceive ourselves. So here we're talking not about those cases of denial where actually we know the facts, but as in the case of the tobacco industry, for example, we have financial, other strategic motivations to suppress those facts, but human beings can engage in a number of mental gymnastics to persuade ourselves, basically, or not even let the question arise that our point of view is the truth and is not actually denial as it is seen from the outside. So various mechanisms of moral disengagement, such as using euphemistic language, blaming the victim, using all kinds of justifications, that they started first, they attacked us, using a different time frame, for example, as to where the events start or what actually belongs in the context of a genocide as opposed to being something else. These kinds of mechanisms have been studied and are important to consider when we talk about issues of denial. Roy Baumeister is another social psychologist whom you might find interesting to look up if you're interested in the underlying psychology. He points to mechanisms such as selective remembering, the way in which we process facts differently based on our group memberships, which you alluded to yesterday as well. The fact that basically we can show from basic research on memory processes that being a member of a certain group or having a certain ideological political stance will make us remember facts differently, will make us cognitively process information differently. We actually forget issues more readily that have to do with harm doing of our group as opposed to something that the other group did against us. Some other issues that come into play, and I should maybe remember, in addition to Roy Baumeister, if you're interested in how these mechanisms work in the context of, for example, Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide, a colleague of mine, Ezelka Bilali, published an article in the special issue that is mentioned in my bio in this conference program on how these mechanisms are used by, in her case it was a sample of Turkish students who were asked to talk about the Armenian events and the strategies they used to describe them. So that's an interesting direct application of those processes to these to the realm we're talking about here. Other processes from the realm of social psychology that are important to consider are group processes and norms. We talked a little bit about this here and there, but basically yesterday we talked a little bit about the possibility of being in an epistemological bubble, or basically engaging in groupthink when we are surrounded by like-minded others, by people who share a similar background or similar values and norms. We might simply be pushed to become more polarized in our ideas when we are not regularly confronted with some different opinions within our group. So group processes, the selective exposure that we have as group members to certain kinds of narratives are all important to consider as well. And then finally, one issue that was brought up, I believe, by my colleague Pamela Steiner, also a psychologist, that in some cases denial occurs as a reaction to identity threats, which we already mentioned, as well as other kinds of threats to our belief systems, to our values, to our ideas about how we want to lead our lives, that we don't want to give up driving our SUVs, for example, just because of climate change, as well as fear, the idea that climate change and the consequences of global warming are very threatening. When we really start to think about it, can push people to engage in the kinds of mental gymnastics that psychologists would call cognitive dissonance, where we change our attitudes, our beliefs about an issue in order to bring them into alignment with each other. These two contradictory cognitions that on the one hand, I want to live and I want my children and the children of my children to live and be healthy. On the other hand, we have this information about how the world, the climate is changing, and I am contributing to that by driving cars and so on and so forth. That is an inconsistent belief system that has to be changed, and we usually bring those two inconsistent beliefs into coherence once again, not by changing our own behavior, but rather by changing our other cognition that is contradictory to our actual behavior. So changing the cognition that, for example, climate change exists. That is a form of defense against these threatening pieces of information that can contribute to denial, and the other form being identity threats, which presumably applies more to cases such as the denial of the Armenian genocide or other instances of genocide and mass atrocities, where we simply have the need as group members to believe that our group is moral, that we ourselves are moral as group members, and this kind of identity threat and the desire to maintain a positive self-esteem and group esteem are fundamental to these issues of denial. So basically, we can see it as a form of psychological coping mechanisms in many ways. And when I say this, I don't mean to exonerate this kind of behavior, because obviously we still have a good degree of free will and agency and the potential to counteract some of these processes very willfully, and we have many examples of cases where members of groups behave quite differently from the mainstream of their group, and we are capable of counteracting even the kinds of subconscious processes that might lead to denial. So I'm not saying this to exonerate this kind of behavior, I'm just saying it to give some psychological context or some ideas about the different kinds of mechanisms that most human beings, or all human beings, as we said before, engage in regularly, and that are part of these expressions of denial. Another point I want to make, or pick up on maybe rather, from the conference is that I think we saw in several different talks, we kind of implicitly, in many cases, or explicitly saw a variety of different forms of denial and lack of acknowledgement. And I think that if we want to continue to build a social science of denial, or to understand this phenomenon more systematically, that we have to look very carefully at these different kinds of distinctions that were brought up. So some of the distinctions that were brought up here were the differences between direct and blatant forms of denial, where someone says, no, this didn't happen, or it did happen, but it's not a genocide, as opposed to more indirect or subtle forms of denial. And we heard a lot about the direct and blatant forms of denial in different forms, perhaps because they're simply more explicit and more annoying when they occur, or give rise to more anger. But we also heard in several talks about a few more subtle forms of denial. For example, the omission of victim groups from commemorations and memorials or textbooks, the omission of certain genocides from, for example, literature on genocide studies or the kinds of museums we have, for example, in this country. We heard this in the talks of the anthropologists mostly, how the different strategies that occur on the collective level, how collective memories of societies are shaped, and the silences that occur, and that I think are very important to put within this framework of denial, so that we start looking at different forms of denial more systematically. And to some extent, Stanley Cohen was brought up by two speakers. So those of you who don't know his work, Stanley Cohen, there's a book, 2001, he's a sociologist, I forget the exact title of the book, but he makes these distinctions between literal denial, interpretative denial, implicatory denial, and then we can start adding other forms of denial, as Ken McLean did in his talk, and some other forms that were alluded to here as well. So to look, for example, not just at denial and explicit and subtle forms of denial, but also simply lack of acknowledgement as a form of denial. So that there's a spectrum on which denial occurs, and it can include these very outright and blatant statements, but it can also include simply ignoring certain facts, not including groups in education, in textbooks, in memorials, and so on. Another distinction that I think came up in several talks was the issue whether denial is strategic and happens for certain financial or political reasons, or whether denial is more in reaction to, for example, group membership and identity, which of course is also strategic in its own ways, but looking at the different motivations that underlie these expressions of denial is important if we want to know how to address denial, because I believe that these different motivations can give rise to very different kinds of strategies if we want to address it. So for example, if the motivation is strategic in terms of image concerns or reputation concerns, as you referred to it, then we might think about strategies where we could work, for example, with the international norms that were mentioned in your talk, where, for example, portraying transitional justice mechanisms and confrontation of societies with their violent past is portrayed as a characteristic of a democratic, progressive society, where perhaps other kinds of peer societies or reference groups are referred to that have also engaged in similar kinds of confrontations with their own past. These kinds of normative debates are changing the perceptions of the norms around how beneficial or positive it would be perceived if the group engages in this kind of behavior, might be effective when the motivation of denial is strategic in nature and has to do with these reputation concerns. If it is more identity-driven, however, and comes from this desire to see the in-group in a positive light and to have a sense of positive self-esteem of the group, then perhaps interventions such as the one you mentioned in your keynote, working with self-affirmation and group affirmation, might be more promising in order to combat the desire or the tendency to engage in denial. Here, for those of you who are interested in the self-affirmation intervention, there's actually also some interesting work by social psychologists on the group level that have used a similar strategy. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Sabina Cehajic-Clancy, do you know that paper? Anyway, those of you who are interested in looking it up, it's in the Journal of Social and Personality Psychology, JPSP, and the authors are Sabina Cihajic-Clancy, Eran Halperin, and some others. They basically looked at these strategies, intervention strategies on the group level in the context of Bosnia and Israel-Palestine, looking at how not self-affirmation but group affirmation, where you give group members the chance to affirm other positive group values, increased their willingness to acknowledge responsibility for their group's harm doing. So this seems to work on that level as well. Here in regard to, I noticed when this idea of norms was discussed, I noticed the sense of kind of cynicism that these cynicism is maybe a harsh word, but basically maybe some caution that these perceived norms might lead to signaling norm change, but it wouldn't necessarily lead to behavior, right? So some skepticism whether this actually will effectively lead to long-term change in people's willingness to acknowledge responsibility of their in-group's harm doing. Here I just want to say again with my psychology hat that maybe there's a more positive outlook, because we know from basic social psychological research that saying is believing, so the more often you actually say something and the more often something is portrayed as a group norm that is valued by your group members, that is common in your society, the more likely it is that people will actually start believing it and kind of accepting it, and then behavior change might follow because of other processes such as another jargon term of social psychologists, self-perception theory, that sometimes we look at our own behavior to get information about our attitudes, and when we see ourselves engaging in, for example, using the G word or acknowledging genocide, acknowledging other facts, simply because we were forced to, that might still, in the long term, give rise to behavior change, actually. There's some experimental evidence from other areas of research, but it gives us the hope that maybe forcing groups through international norms or through processes such as those that happened in Germany after the Second World War actually work in the long run. And it's not just, it might be strategic in the beginning, that people do it because they are forced to, or because they have some strategic gain from reputational benefits, for example. In the long term, it might actually then change to lead to behavior change, as we see in the German example, where Germans were not very happy in the beginning to, and actually now once again they're not very happy perhaps, but it wasn't necessarily, it didn't come from a German initiative to engage in this acknowledgement campaign, but over time, if it becomes normative and people basically have a tendency to accept what is normative in their societies and justify the system, it can actually then lead to long-term attitudinal change as well and become internalized. How much more time?
You're out.
I'm out? Okay, can I just say one more minute or 2 more minutes? Because I just want to very quickly at the end bring up a topic that hasn't really been raised at all at this conference, that is quite important, and that I find quite important, and that most of my research in this area focuses on, which is the victim group's perspective on acknowledgement. So we talked a lot about the perpetrator groups, or just broader societies, forms of denial, but I think it is equally important to examine the effect that acknowledgement and denial has on members of the members of the victim group, and also what forms of acknowledgement are perceived to be sufficient and valuable. So some of the research I have been doing with the Armenian community, with the Jewish American community, first of all showed that acknowledgement versus denial has a very dramatic impact on people's psychological well-being. So we can see some quite strong effects when people are confronted with cases of denial, or even these more passive cases of lack of acknowledgement by omitting, for example, the group's history from official narratives. It translates into direct increases or decreases in various forms of positive and negative affect, for example. So depressive states, sadness, anger, basically psychological well-being, which has to be taken very seriously. The second point is when we ask group members what they actually perceive as adequate forms of acknowledgement that wouldn't, that would counteract denial, or that would be a counterpoint to denial, the victim group's answers might look quite different from what we think those answers are, or from what the perpetrator group thinks acknowledgement would be. So just to give one example and then end with that, in my Armenian samples, for example, when I simply ask who acknowledges, who doesn't acknowledge, what constitutes proper acknowledgement, and what are some forms of denial that you encounter, the use of the Armenian word, and I apologize, I forgot the exact Armenian word, for the Armenian genocide, which could be seen as a form of acknowledgement, is actually seen quite critically because it is seen as a way to avoid using the word genocide.
Yeah,
so from the outsider's perspective, we might say, look, it's great, they used even the Armenian word for genocide, that is the ultimate form of acknowledgement, that must be a very positive step for Turkish-Armenian or Armenian-American relations. However, the victim group might interpret it very differently, so when we think about denial, I believe it is equally important to ask the various victim groups what kind of acknowledgement they want as a counterpoint to denial. And I'll end with that. Sorry for going over the time if we did.
Well, I'm glad I gave you a few minutes of my time because my understanding for this session was quite different. I thought we were going to have sort of an open exchange here, and I learned much from your paper, and I thank you. I just have a few additional comments. I've said mainly what I wanted to say already. But I was struck by the fact, let me first say that a couple of years ago, for the first time I heard Mark Mamagonian do something similar with tobacco advertising the Armenian genocide. And it seemed rather strange to me. It seemed like there were apples and oranges there that were being compared. But today I understood that this is something that goes across the board. It's not just tobacco. It goes to climate change, it goes to warming and other kinds of things. I'm not positive how strong the connection is. I think there are differences of state-organized denial and maybe private industry, maybe not. But in any case, I found this theme, a unifying theme today when we were able to connect these. I'm also troubled. Look, I've written more than one article on denial, trying to analyze it, assess it, characterize it. But it's not a happy subject. And the question is, what good does it do? Because there is nothing that we can say, I think, or do, that will persuade the denier to change their position, because their position is not based on knowledge, scholarship, or what we would consider academic kinds of things. And so it's almost an exercise in futility. We're talking to each other. And who's listening? Well, in the denier camp. So this is something that troubles me, even though, as I say, I myself have spent quite a bit of time, not willingly, unwillingly, on this. As a matter of fact, I'm not an Armenian genocide scholar at all, and I backed into this subject simply because of denial. Simply because I was being told that my father's experience of having been driven from his village with his pregnant mother and 2-year-old brother, who went on to the death marches and died, and he was simply rescued by chance that a Kurdish tribesman took him away as slave labor or a free servant, and that intervention saved his life. So when people like me and others are hearing that this didn't happen, it does something to you, and I backed into the field. A good example of this is when Stanford Shaw, who was my colleague at UCLA, published a 2-volume history of the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. He really set the standard for modern denial, academic denial. It was Cambridge University Press. He was able to frame things in a way that the Armenians were continuously terrorists, revolutionary terrorists, and their komitajis, their committees, did unspeakable things. And that when it came down to the deportations, these, of course, were done in the most humane manner. And he cites what I call a lying document. This attitude, if you cite an archival document, it has to be true. Someone just recently talked about the need to dovetail documents. And in this case, the official document says that the Armenians are to be relocated from a particular area, but they're to be cared for in every way. They're to be assured food and water and housing. They're to be assured medical attention, that their properties should be inventoried and kept, and if other people were to live in their houses, they would have to pay rent, and so when the actual owners returned, that they would be paid. It's an official document. And so if you have someone, a denier, who cites this document as truth without questioning it, or even knowing that there was not the way it worked out, well, let me just say that when he wrote the book, I wrote a long review in which I listed at least 50 serious errors in that volume, which should have been a signal that this is not a trustworthy volume. But what happened? It was republished a year later, and all the corrections or errors that I had pointed out, names and dates and so forth, he had simply corrected them all. And so I helped him. I helped him by pointing out the errors there too. It didn't change his attitude. It made it, it just made it a better work, a better piece of denial. It's for me, it's concerning. This fellow Erickson, who we've been hearing about, and I expect it's not the last we're going to hear about him, he is the most sophisticated of the deniers. He cites hundreds and hundreds of Turkish archival references. And if you are naive, or not even naive, unknowledgeable of this period, it is a convincing argument that the Armenians were in widespread insurgency and that the Ottoman government had to engage itself in counterinsurgency. And very cleverly, then, in a way that I said that the Turkish ambassador in the United States had told the United Americans that, look, you relocated your Japanese in World War II, we had to do the same thing. So we have Erickson saying, hey, we just followed what the West had done. What the Spanish did in Cuba, what the Americans did in the Philippines, what the British did in South Africa, and that was to separate the rebellious or fighting population from its base, that is, its sympathetic base of population. So that, this is something we learned from the West, and we just followed through in the same manner. The title of his book, and I didn't mean to talk about this, but I will, is in itself revealing. The title of his last book, he's written now, the first one was Order to Die, which is a history of the Ottoman Army, which was quite interesting, and there are a lot of military details and history that we learned there. But the last book that just came out from Utah University Press is titled Ottomans and Armenians. Ottomans and Armenians. In other words, Ottomans on one side, Armenians on the other. The Armenians are not Ottomans. Armenians, he already tells you in the title, are the other. They're the enemy, because it's Ottomans versus the Armenians. And at the same time, on the cover of the book, a picture of an armed Armenian band with rifles, which would already tell you the story of this book. And that's why I made the point, I think that there should be some accountability and demands for accountability. This is a university press, and even though you have a series that is run by this man, certainly the university has a press has a director. Has anyone asked this director, what is your policy regarding peer reviews? Who decides? If I mentioned a volume that came to me for review from 2 different presses, the persons that individual had suggested to the 2 presses to whom they should send this manuscript for review are all these people that we've talked about. So, you know, it was probably just by chance that somebody decided, well, let's send it to Hovannisian too, because if it had been sent to these people, the book would be in press. So I think there is some need for demanding accountability. I don't think this is liturgical. I don't think it's a matter of a lawsuit. I think it's a matter of saying, you know, you're responsible here. What are you doing? Who decides? How does it happen that a person who recommends a book on the back of it, you know, a blurb, then is asked to review the same book that he's already read and approved? And this is not, this is not impartial reviewing. So it's an issue. It's an issue. Professor Akçam made 2 announcements today that I'm not sure. You know, I think we should be happy or hopeful, but I'm not sure because Heather this morning talked about signaling. And is this a kind of a signal of lip service of saying, look how far we're going, or is it a means to tell the world, Europe and America, look, look where we're going. We don't need a statement from Obama. We don't need intervention from any of your, you know, stop your efforts for recognition. It allows all the people, Obama's and others, say, you know, look, these people are dealing now with this issue. They're facing it. So we don't have to get involved. We don't have to get, that's my fear. And I hope I'm wrong. In any case, it's a groundbreaking gesture, and it remains to be seen if these individuals will simply be co-opted and rewarded for their co-optation, or if they will stand their grounds. And I've seen a lot of that in Armenia itself. There's been similar co-optation, so it's not a Turkish thing, but one that is there. Finally, the question that was raised today is, how do you engage people without turning them off and pushing them farther away? And it may be phony, and it may be, well, I don't know, contrived, but I've done that. I've tried to do it by differentiating between the government and the people, by differentiating between the Young Committee on Union and Progress, the dictatorial clique, and the common person, even though I know that the common person was implicated in great numbers, far more than any other, any Holocaust implication. participation of civilians, at least in Germany. And also to point out that in every Armenian survivor story, there is a good Muslim, a good Turk, a good Arab, a good Kurd. I mean, the man that took my father was not a good Kurd. He took him to exploit him, but it was an intervention. But there were not a few Muslims who felt that this was against the Holy Book and felt that they needed to do something to try to intervene. Now, this may be taking them off the hook more than they deserve because there was massive participation for economic and other reasons. On the other hand, it is a means, I think, of sort of reaching out and saying, okay, you know, we're not blaming you as an individual. And let's make it easier for you also to blame those other guys and say, you know, it's not us. Well, that's it. Thank you.
Okay. I can't believe you guys are still awake. This was a long day. I'm going to give you a few more minutes of it. So my name is Massimo Pigliucci. I'm a philosopher of science at the City College of New York. Although my initial background is actually in evolutionary biology, and that's where I got into denialism to begin with, having lived 9 years in Knoxville, Tennessee, near Dayton, Tennessee, where the Scopes trial took place back in 1925. So what I'm going to try to put forth are some thoughts, some things that I picked up from this entire day and from yesterday's keynote speaker. And I'm trying to put them in some kind of logical order, at least the way I see them, to make a couple of general points. So first of all, it seems to me that abundantly clear at this point that denialism is not about the facts. Indeed, insisting on facts may have counterproductive effects, as Brendan clearly showed yesterday. I say this because this is the first mistake that a lot of my colleagues, especially in the natural sciences, make. They go up to a creationist and say, oh, I'm going to straight him out. I'm going to tell him how things are. And then they fully expect, and are sorely disappointed, to walk away from a debate having convinced everybody. So it's not about the facts, although that doesn't mean, of course, that it's not crucial to get the facts straight. The fact that denialism is not about the facts shouldn't be taken as an excuse for saying, well, then I can be lax with the facts as much as the other side is. It's also, and this is a little bit more disturbing even for me, and a more recent realization, it's not about critical thinking either, at least not if we understand critical thinking in the way in which it is taught in philosophy departments, or the way in which people outside of philosophy think that they're teaching critical thinking. That is, it's not about explaining to people the nature of inference and running them through the basic logical fallacies and formal fallacies. In fact, even there, denialists have caught up. They've learned to use the vocabulary of formal fallacies. It's not unusual these days to have a debate with somebody on climate change, and they say, and then you say, well, you know, I think climate change is a fact because it's an established fact, because there's a consensus among the scientific community. And the response is, that's an argument from authority, which is an informal logical fallacy. Okay, so that route is also precluded because there is a twisting of what a logical fallacy actually is. What then? What commonalities can we find across instances of denialism? I do think that there's quite a bit in common, actually, between the kinds of cases that we've been discussing today. And it seems clear to me that the commonality is an ideological underpinning of one sort or another. That ideological underpinning can be religious, can be ethnical, can be political, but it is a strong ideological commitment to something, and that something represents a big part of somebody's identity. That's what we're having a problem That's why critical thinking isn't going to help, and that's why the facts are in fact irrelevant. Now we've seen that denialists exploit the inherent tentative nature of scientific findings. They'll say, aha, now all scientists agree on climate change, only 99% of them. So there's room for doubt. That to me indicates, of course, a very poor appreciation of the nature of science, which I encountered many years ago in Tennessee. You know, evolution is just a theory. It's somebody's opinion, it's a hunch. Somebody got up in the morning and said, well, I got this theory. And so your theory is as good as mine. They also exploit, as it has been clear during our discussions, the media's self-imposed balanced approach to presenting facts. This was again pointed out by our keynote speaker yesterday. This has been known for a while, that there's been, because it's a recent phenomenon, rather recent phenomenon in the media. This, American journalism in the 1950s and 60s wasn't like this at all. And it's complicated by a number of things. First of all, most Americans do react positively to that kind of attitude because it strikes at a core value of fairness, right? If there is another opinion, the other opinion has to be heard. I've heard people making that argument who are not denialists, who have no business or no beef in the discussion, but yet they say, well, yeah, of course I want to hear the other side, as if the other side were equally reliable. This is complicated greatly, I think, by the fact that contemporary journalism is in crisis. I have a number of friends who are professional journalists, and they are desperate in terms of the situation for their profession. This is not helped at all by the rise of the blogosphere, and I speak as somebody who has actually run a blog for more than a dozen years at this point. Because people seem to be entitled to any opinion regardless of the facts. They seem to think that blogs actually can replace news outlets such as NPR, the New York Times, or The Guardian, and so on and so forth. Because after all, you can write, and you can write for free, and information should be available for free, regardless of the fact that information is actually provided by people who still need to pay a rent and other bills. So I think this is complicated by the issue with the mass media at the moment. And I don't even want to go into the, again, recent phenomenon of the 24-hour news cycle, which has given rise to things like fall news and so on and so forth. Now, we've also heard a few minutes ago a plug for psychology, and of course I'm going to make one for philosophy at the table, this discussion table. But we also need to consider, for instance, sociology. Especially, one of the things that have not come up yet in this discussion is the study of anti-intellectualism in the United States, which is a well-established part of sociological literature since the classic work by Richard Hofstadter. Anti-intellectualism is particularly present in the United States. It's very unusually so compared to other Western countries. It has a particular history. It has 3 to 4 different kind of roots, which were discussed by Hofstadter. And that should be part of the big picture. Denialism studies, I'm very happy to use that term, seems to me, therefore, to be a highly interdisciplinary field. In fact, the most interdisciplinary field I can think of. We have heard, or we should have heard, or we would have heard if we had more time instead of just one day, from people from history, political science, law, natural science, from physics to biology, psychology, sociology, philosophy in various forms, from political philosophy to ethics to epistemology, to mention just the major contributors. It really doesn't get any more interdisciplinary than this, it seems to me, which I think is a positive. Now, what are we going to do about it? Because, I know that as academics we're perfectly content to just talk about this stuff and not do anything about it, or at least that's the image that we seem to project into the outside world. But I think we are in a position to ask the question what to do about it. And we've heard some suggestions actually over the last day or so. There's several things. One, the data itself shows that we should shift the focus from persuading individuals to making political and media elites accountable. This is Brandon's stuff from last night. That doesn't mean not trying to talk to individuals or the public at large, but it seems that if you want a bang for your buck, you probably should focus on a much smaller and much more influential number of politicians and media. Another thing to do, well, we should learn from the detailed study, I think, of successful cases. We heard of the tobacco industry debacle, for instance. That need to be unpacked in as much detail as possible to see what worked, what happened, and how it can be replicated in other similar situations. And we should also, we heard today from, I think also from Brendan, that we can take a look at case studies acknowledging rather than denying genocide, for instance, in different nations, and say, okay, what happened there? What was the situation culturally, politically, in terms of media and so on and so forth. What else to do? Well, my experience with denialism in the area of evolution taught me that we need allies. In the case of evolution denial, it is simply not very useful. In fact, I think it's damaging to allow a strident atheist like Dawkins, or even a good human one like myself, to engage creationists. They're just not listening, because I'm immediately disqualified from rational discourse in their mind, because of course I got an agenda, okay? And it is far more effective, it has been far more effective in the discussions with creation, evolution denial, to have clergy involved in the debate, or to ask religious scientists to do so. Okay? Those are the people that actually, you know, they're closer to the denialists. They are seen, if not as friends, at least people that speak the same language. And I think, therefore, that the rest of us, in this particular case, you know, atheists or non-religious people, just need to go to the background and provide support, but not do it as from the front line, because it's not going to help. In fact, it's going to do damage. And finally, one more comment. This one I heard, I think it was Mark who made this comment before, and I think it was an important one which is worth discussing further, and deals with housekeeping within the academia. Of course, we've been talking about the Dame University Press for a long time at this point. But so the problem here is that
no idea.
Yeah, right. The delicate balance between how to strike the delicate balance between freedom, academic freedom, and academic integrity. Right? I mean, that's the issue. We don't want to get into a situation where we ourselves start witch hunting or pressuring in a way that can easily be perceived as curtailing academic freedom. Academic freedom is paramount. And yes, it does count. Freedom comes with responsibility, for sure. But it's a really tricky balance to go about these things. And I think even in that case, we can learn from the success stories. I mean, I've heard a case that I was not aware of, actually, about Princeton. But there's been a case in my area a number of years ago where Cambridge University Press, certainly not a slouch in terms of publishers, published this book by a very well-known creationist that was couched in mathematical terms and all that sort of stuff. But it was published in allegedly peer review line of books, and it never happened again. And the reason it never happened again is because the book got lambasted immediately by a number of scientists, by a number of philosophers. That embarrassed the press and the editor, and that never happened again, at least as far as I know. So again, we need to look at where these things work and how can they be replicated, because they do work apparently. I mean, it would be really awful if we had no single case to point to where we had success, but we actually do. There's a number of cases across the board, and those are the ones that we, I think, want to learn from and replicate. Thank you.
I would just make one brief comment on the last point regarding, you know, you gave the example of the clergy and talking to the clergy, and I think in the particular case of the Armenian genocide, much has changed after scholars from Turkey or from within Turkey have started addressing the Armenian genocide, right? It is, and even more so, I would argue, when individuals who had parents, grandparents of Armenian ancestry who were taken away from the Armenian community, what is referred to as the Hidden Armenians, you know, started telling their stories. And it's very difficult to argue with your neighbor. Yes?
If I may, this actually is a comment also with the question that's been raised a few minutes ago, which is, you know, why talk to the nihilists that might change their mind? I think that's a mistake to put in those terms. We don't talk to the denialists, we talk to third parties. It's never an issue of convincing, you know, I never even tried to convince a hardcore creationist. I was always, even during debates, talking to the third parties, to the fence sitters, to people that may kind of sort of be on one side or the other, but are not completely the other way. Because those are, after all, they're actually the majority. And those are the people that then talk to other people, and you get this cascade effect. So, for instance, the idea that Turkish scholars are pivotal, crucial for that sort of change, but they didn't do it by themselves. They do it because they also have there was a general milieu, a general intellectual environment that encouraged them and prompted them to do that, and then they need to do it.
Yes, absolutely. Again, in the case of Turkey, the external pressure, in fact, is what kept the issue of the Armenian genocide on the internal agenda. So on the short term, yes, there was this immediate reaction of, if they're pushing us to recognize, we are not going to recognize, we're going to deny it. But I think on the longer term, there is this move through individuals that have been, again, the way in which probably, it's a problematic parallel, but the University of Utah Press is trying to manufacture doubt in the United States about the Armenian genocide, right? People like Taner Akçay manufacture doubt in Turkey. And, sometimes the two, right, the process works to a certain extent in the same way. But I will not go on, and I will open it up to discussion. You can make comments. Some of those who presented earlier can address some of the issues that were talked here. You can ask questions or make general comments about the conference. Yes, Burak. I know you're the pessimist, so
I actually sort of changed my mind, so...
Then you're asking.
Okay. No, many people brought their disciplinary approaches, and my thoughts were all over the place. But after listening to Vollhardt and Pigliucci, I actually gathered some of them. And I'm gonna try to speak as an economist, sort of. And all this, during 2 days, what I gathered is that denialism is inevitable. Because it's part of people's national identity, which is onset early, religious identity, maybe later, political identity. So there is always supply. And there is also demand, because some people feel excluded, some people feel the need for affirmation. So when there is supply and demand, denialism is not going away. So what can we do to change the price of denial? What can we do to make it more costly? So as an economist would say about supply shocks and demand shocks. So we can try to make the product more costly, which worked in Princeton case. But sometimes the product is so inelastic that shocks won't work. Like the fight against tobacco industry is won, but people still smoke cigarettes. The truth is out there, but there is still demand because it's an addictive product. And denial might be an addictive product too. So, and another, if shocks don't work, if supply shock, demand shock, that doesn't work, what we can do is we can put on the market a competitive product. What's the antithesis of denial? It's, well, if denialists start getting affirmation, we can say, oh, you know what? Fighting against denialism is actually a more satisfactory product. If you're in Turkey and everybody's in denial, then you know what? Which is going to enlighten you, which is going to make you feel better? Fight for the truth, which you might disagree with in the first place, but it can be another source of self-affirmation for you. And that's the first part. And the second part of my comments is going to be briefer. When we talked about denial, in its definition, there is fact too. Like if there is no fact, there is no denial. And in life, there are issues that, political issues that put us in a sense of urgency. And when even there is gray area, we feel the urge to politicize the issue and we take sides, which is for the good sometimes. But that also can lead to a prospective denial, because when we are forced to take sides in the current state of mind, the arguments that we present might turn against us later in life. This is an abstract concept, and I will not be able to bring up any examples. But one thing I was, especially after listening to an evolutionary biologist, I was thinking about Darwin's theory of evolution, which was groundbreaking at the time, but now it's outdated, because it's been 150 years, or maybe even more. And there are creationists who use Darwin's parts of his theory that are not applicable anymore against evolution. So it's like facts aren't facts always. And when there is a gray area, the idea of fighting for the truth, fighting for the good, can actually be hurtful. So going back, again, like this is not like a generalization, but I think this is something that we should be aware of. I'm going back to my initial point. I think the best way to approach this is denial, to see denial as a product and to realize that we're not producing that product, so we cannot alter it. That people, like, you know, there are potato chips that says, oh, this one has 10 grams of fiber, which is good for your heart. But you're still potato chip, like you're not good for my heart. But the label says so. It's actually sort of a norm signaling, maybe. The producer of the potato chip says, oh, you know what, let's put this label on, so it's going to be a miracle. It's the same thing with denial. Whenever there is a public outrage, maybe, or when the price changes, the producer alters the product, and we cannot do anything to change the product. But what we can do is put on other products that will challenge that product, which is going to taste better, or just make it more costly for people who produce it.
Thank you. Doubt is our product, right? Yes.
I want to thank the organizers and the panelists and everyone for putting this on, and I hope that there's going to be some kind of a report or summary that would be produced for consumption beyond just this very knowledgeable audience, because there's some good ground that's been plowed here, and we need to take that out to benefit all others who are engaged in the conversation, and to include others who are not engaged, to get them engaged. That's the first comment. And I think the other one is, as we think about commonalities, and I want to speak not as an economist or social scientist, but as a human being at this conference. One of the things we've not touched on, and I think might be helpful in broadening debate and moving to action from just the ivory tower, is to think about something called the tragedy of the commons. We've not been successful in making denial everybody's problem. And each community that's been victimized is working in its own little corner. And until we are able, just as in the case of GMOs and climate change, to make this a collective benefit for all of humanity, so that you're working on it. I should be just as outraged at Armenian genocide denial as any Armenian survivor. Same thing with Rwanda or Holocaust. We need to get to that level so that we engage the entire human community to not only fight against it, but to convince those who are being misinformed of what the truth is and what appropriate behavior is for the survival of all humanity.
Thank you. I'll take Brendan, and then I'll give the panelists an opportunity to reflect. Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so just picking up on this point on what Massimo was saying, I think a way to think about this holding elites accountable is as a, if you actually, I think of the misinformation as being the supply and the demand being the public, the portion of the public that's responsive to that. And the reputational costs within professional communities, I think, are powerful, right? The reason that Princeton was shamed is not because the broader public was upset about this, but because they were embarrassed within academic circles. So professional communities that have stronger epistemic norms of adhering to scholarship and evidence are powerful, and that could be lawyers, it could be doctors, it could be scientists, but in a lot of cases, the producers of these are within those circles of various kinds, or those circles are intersecting with politicians. Like, there are lots of ways beyond. I just wanted to suggest that we can get out of a simplistic public communication framework and think about all the different kinds of reputational costs that can be attached to spreading this information, and that there are lots of points of leverage that aren't a silencing strategy, but really a reputational one. But I think it's a really important point to not just think about the public.
Thank you, and this really also addresses some of the Luann's comments earlier today. Would any of the panelists do?
I have a comment about the tobacco thing. So he's spoken like a true economist, of course, in terms of demand and supply. And there's, I certainly think there's a value in that. But the case of the tobacco industry is interesting because actually it shows just how many different factors can play into the outcome. First of all, yes, it's true, cigarettes are still addictive and people still smoke, but certainly not as many as they used to. I mean, the percentage has gone down dramatically. So clearly there has been an effect. And what was the cause of that effect? Well, in part I think it was in fact the overreaching of the industry and the shaming that came out sort of almost universal in the media, and I mean, when comedians are sort of making fun of you in the end, if that's it, you're done. But it was also, quite frankly, talking about incentives and disincentives, taxes. We know from data, especially starting in Canada and then in Western Europe, the major reason why smoking goes down is because you bring the taxes out, and it costs, literally, in that case, costs more. It's not a matter of reputation or anything. It just literally costs more. So all of those things can be applied. We just need to have the imagination necessary to say, okay, so those are the basic mechanisms that seem to work. These are the examples in which they work. So how can I translate that into these other situations? And sometimes it's going to be obviously more difficult than others. It's not like it isn't going to be a simple solution. But I also wanted to pick up on a comment a minute ago about the idea that we need to remember this is a long-term game. We're not here for the success within the next week or the next month or the next year. It's a perennial battle, and if we make gains are going to be measured over years, decades, or longer. Unfortunately, they don't give grants for decades or longer projects, but they do give tenure. At least a few universities at this point still do. So we do. That's why I think actually I know that the term public intellectualism is a little pretentious, but I think that's what it is that we're talking about. Public intellectualism needs to be brought back into force in this country. It used to be a force for good, and it is now sort of a term of pretentiousness or ridicule. It shouldn't be, and that's one of the things that we need to realize, that academics, especially academics with tenure, do have the luxury to be able to engage in these kind of things. You can be threatened with lawsuits, but most of those don't go anywhere. And yes, you waste, we heard earlier, you may waste 3 months of your life having to deal with these kind of things. I think it's worth it. Engaging in these sort of issues which may have really broad, long-term reach. Frankly, in my mind, it's worth my time more than publishing in another technical paper that is going to be read by 10 colleagues and published 5 and mentioned 5 times by somebody else.
Would you like to? Okay, so yes, in fact, the tobacco industry is a good example of how this is this fight is under the long haul, right? It's not something that's going to change overnight. I have Hank, Mark, and then George and Alex. Yes, Hank.
We had some really, I think, very interesting insights in terms of the various structural features of different kinds of denial approaches and the ways in which those work sort of across these different issues. But there's another issue that I think is really worth looking at in the context of this conference, and it was something that Sean and I were talking about before. And then is the actual material connections between some of the issues that we're talking about. And specifically, recently, a couple of genocide scholars, actually a few genocide scholars, particularly Alex Alvarez and Herb Hirsch, have claimed, and are sort of beginning to look at this, and there's a lot of research that needs to be done, that global warming will be the biggest force in producing genocide in the 21st century because of the ways in which, the sort of indirect way within a context of politically oppressive control of resources and the management of scarce resources will affect sort of conflicts and power structures within societies. And so when we think of denial of global warming, the implication of that, long-term obviously is like a broad destruction of the human race and so forth, but the shorter-term immediate issue is producing genocide. And we're already, this is already a serious component, or has been a serious component in the case of Darfur, where the sort of increased desertification and loss of land was one of the key pressures that produced the genocidal process. So we're, in some sense, we're talking about the real material implications of denial that are devastating. So it's worth maybe, tying things together that way as well.
Yes. So it's not only that there are parallels, but actually there's connections. Mark?
Thanks. A couple of things. One, I wanted to mention the work of someone I've read quite a bit, and whose work pertains to what we're talking about these couple of days. Robert Proctor from Stanford, who has written extensively both about tobacco denial and related issues, but also the author or editor of a volume called Agnotology, which is about the production of ignorance, which is now a field, I guess, or at least it's a term. And it's an important concept, that ignorance isn't necessarily a naturally occurring state. Sometimes it's a produced state. And his work is very interesting and important. I wanted to say to Richard that I can't think of a better endorsement of the approach I've tried to take than that you may have accepted it. I think I'd rather have that than anything else. But to the point that Brendan and Massimo were making, I understand intellectually the value, the fact that deniers are going to react more violently when confronted by experts. An evolutionary scientist is going to produce more of a reaction than someone less threatening. But it's troubling, the idea that somehow these things have to be done through proxies who are maybe don't have the expertise that you do on evolutionary science, or someone else has on genocide. That the people who are most knowledgeable somehow have to recede into the background. I find that upsetting in a way.
Yeah, when I comment on check your points. Maybe that's not exactly what I mean. First of all, yes, I would be troubled too. That wasn't exactly what I was suggesting, but I'm not saying that evolutionary biologists, for instance, should not write for the public about evolution and explain. That they should definitely do that. The issue is, don't expect the main target of those writings to be the fundamentalist Christian. But hopefully the idea is that if the biologist does do that and does a good job, he will or she will reach somebody that is closer to that area, and in that way sort of propagate the message. The other thing, the thing that I do actually think I have a significant problem with are people like Dawkins. Because it simply does not help anyone to yell at the other side and say, you're a bunch of idiots. I don't know what has gone into that kind of public discourse, and somebody thinks that even if there are idiots on the other side, because sometimes there are, but even if there are, when was the last time you heard anybody saying, oh, you're right, I'm an idiot, I just changed my mind? What? Right, so that was mostly the objection.
Thank you, Jennifer, and then George and Alex.
So I really appreciated all the synthesizing comments. They were really helpful, and I especially liked your comments, Johanna. And I wanted to, what you said about psychological research on norms is really interesting, because international relations scholars actually make the same points, that states, if they adopt the rhetoric of international norms, even if they do it initially instrumentally, that over time this instrumental lip service can actually lead to compliance and actually socialization rather than just rhetorical instrumental signaling. And I suggested at the end of my paper that might not be the case if the rhetoric is intended to have this particular purpose of resisting pressures for compliance. I'm not positive that this is universally the case, and I guess I want to ask you something and then sort of pose a broader question, which is there psychological research that this thing that you said operates at the individual level operates at a higher level of aggregation? Because I think that's often a problem, especially, so I'm an international relations scholar, right? So I think about states, or at least really large aggregated actors. And in the field of transitional justice, a big problem, or I think a flaw in a lot of research, has been inferring from the individual level that the same thing is going to happen at the level of an aggregate. Maybe not, who knows. So I guess I would ask you, one, is there any evidence of that? And two, I think another axis that's been kind of fluid throughout our discussion has been who is the actor we're talking about doing the denial. So I think in terms of states, but a lot of you are thinking about individuals, and so I wonder what differences there are.
Yeah, I mean, psychological research has the individual as the unit of analysis and not the state level. However, one could argue or point out that, of course, those people making the decisions are individuals, and they're informed.
I'd love to hear what you're saying.
And they are informed by, presumably, also taking into account the interests of their voter constituencies and so on, right? So in that respect, individual change might also influence the state level, but I agree that, of course, one has to look at the two levels of analysis separately and cannot just make that jump. The case, the case studies or anecdotal examples that one can look at, such as Germany, would suggest that there has been such a shift that at some point of time, right after the war, when it was imposed, there was individual rejection of that kind of taking on those that guilt, and it went through a phase where it has been more internalized by individuals and normalized in the political sphere. Then, of course, there are always people who, there's always backlash, and there's the Schlussstrich-Debatte in Germany as well, so it's not so straightforward. But one could argue that one would see this kind of trickle down, or maybe rather trickle up effect eventually.
Thank you. George, Alex, and then Luan.
Yeah, I don't have as long a history as Richard, but I have a history of political activism that has to deal with denial. And at the same, and I absolutely agree in the sense that denial is not about the facts, but at the same time we're saying that the way that we've succeeded over the years responding in certain cases is through the facts, by having good scholarship. And the reason that we're saying both things is because it depends on who you're talking about, right? And who the denier is. And so we have the spectrum of denial, and we've been jumping around in talking about solutions and responses because we're jumping around about who we're talking about in the sense of the denial. But in the long run, good scholarship in facts is what leads to acknowledgement and through the majority, say. I consider the Armenian genocide now as much different in its acceptance than it was 30 years ago because of the scholarship of those that have written on it. It overcame that denial that had everything going for it. Money, state, power was overcome by good scholarship in the facts. So that gets you to a certain point, and then you'll have the deniers that are always going to be there, that you're not going to overcome. And the reason those deniers are always going to be there is because it gets to what these two gentlemen were saying, is that there's a value to it. There's financial gain to it. Those that have, whether it's the tobacco industry or the oil industry. So the response when we're talking about those actors is, what's the cost of delayed acknowledgement? And while we've talked about a lot of things in studying denial, we didn't talk about the cost of delayed acknowledgement as a price that could dissuade future denials. Because what was the cost? If there wasn't, then you're not going to stop it. If there was no penalty, even with the great magnitude that the tobacco industry paid, that they still financially made out better than if they acknowledged earlier, then you're going to have, if Germany did not make out better by acknowledging in restitution, and Turkey has made out better financially, and I believe that they've paid a tremendous, they've invested tremendous political capital to maintain this denial that's been costly to them, and the argument can be made that if they had just acknowledged and atoned for it earlier, that Turkey would be in a better position today, and I think for the population beyond the mark. So this is I would suggest that there's an area of scholarship there, or research, is to study that if you're talking about getting that last bastion of denial that is a possibility anyways. That's from an economic standpoint, thinking about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the cost of delayed acknowledgement, but the cost, sometimes there's a benefit to delayed acknowledgement.
Well,
right?
that's not- well-
Because nobody's around anymore, kind of thing, right? If you wait it out long enough.
Clearly, that's why
right?
the denial exists.
Exactly. And so it's that cost and benefit, so we go back to that,
But I'm
that
just saying, that
situation.
if there is a benefit, then you're not
Yes.
going to remove denial, right?
Yes.
And you're not going to stop it, right? Because there's a benefit to doing that.
Alex?
Yeah, I'd just like to also thank, again, the organizers, and all of the co-sponsors. But I wanted to, maybe for a step back, begin with a flip provocative statement, and ask, to what extent can a focus on denial reproduce denial? Okay, and by that, what I mean is that denial assumes a certain sort of stance, and as we've talked, it typically has been sort of a verbal, political, we couched it as explicit ideological stance. What we haven't attended to as much is, what I think of, I'm looking for is hidden genocide, silence. And I think Mark's, going back to the Proctor article, the Proctor book, introduction to his book about ignorance, seems to me a much more productive term. So if we were to talk about manufacturing ignorance, it seems to me it would open up the ability to talk not just about denial, but to a whole set of processes that are interlinked, including the production of ignorance that may not be as overt. So if we focus simply on this one dimension, are we, again, if you go back to the notion of, say, genocide, why don't you get genocide? Or no, why don't you get it? We may not be attending to other things, including cases of sort of implicit denial, silent denial. And to give you a case, so we're talking about Burma, for example, the Rohingya, who's paying attention, the DRC, who talks about the DRC. There are all sorts of cases and things that are going on that certainly in a sense are a form of denial, but they aren't sort of explicitly state-driven in any sense. Right? They're sort of hidden from view, or they're ignored. And it seems the concerns and the things we talk about touch upon those things, but yet we're not talking about them. So do we need a sort of bigger umbrella than just sort of this singular focus on denial, but an umbrella that would include those things we're talking about with denial?
Yes.
So I think I see what you're saying, and certainly we're all concerned about ignorance, but I do think that there's a distinction between that and denialism. Most denialists are not ignorant at all. At least when I looked at the ones that I know most closely, the one about evolution, climate change and all that, they know a lot of stuff about evolution and climate change. So this isn't a question of ignorance, this is a question of willful rejection of a scientific consensus, which is rooted in that kind of emotional, ideological attachment, etc., etc. So it's not, that's why I said that my first comment was facts don't matter. To convince, if the goal is to convince the denialists, yes, they do matter in the terms of we still need the fact to get the facts straight, so we need the scholarship. But if we're going to think that the scholarship is going to solve the problem, or that teaching people facts is going to solve the problem, it's mistaken. That isn't demonstrably not the problem, at least in the kinds of denialism that I am aware of, that I study more closely. So ignorance is a broader problem for sure, but I'm not sure that denialism is a subset of it, because in fact, a lot of denialists know quite a bit more than the average person about whatever it is that they're denying.
Thank you. In fact, this...
Yeah, just to add to that, I don't want to throw around too many different terms, but that is why I also mentioned the importance of talking also about acknowledgement and what the victim group perceives as acknowledgement, because this also broadens the range and goes beyond just these blatant forms of denial to capture, for example, silence, omission, and any kind of expressions that are perceived to be lacking in acknowledgement of the victim group's experience, for example. But now we have already 3 terms to choose from. The sentiment is the same.
In terms of manufacturing ignorance that you mentioned, and the agnotology thing, it reminds me of a quote by a Turkish thinker, Sakal Celal, who says, "This much ignorance is only possible by education." So it's Luan.
Thank you. A little while ago, there was a dialogue here about levels of discourse, right, between states as aggregated actors on one hand, and grassroots individual psychology, and what could be possibly mediating between them. And here's where I again want to suggest there are several actors that mediate between them. First of all, professional communicators, right? They are employed by states, they're employed by entities, and they reach grassroots individuals. That's actually their function. So we have professional communicators, we have journalists, we have activists, and I can speak as an activist as well as a communicator or a scholar. Attorneys, right? I think of the attorney for the University of Minnesota who defended the university in a federal court, on an academic freedom case, and actually, and did a beautiful job. But what all of these people in the middle need, what all of us need, okay, is we need good scholarship, A, to be done, and B, to be made accessible to people like us, okay? We need that, and so we're scholars, so I don't think scholars have to recede into the background here. I understand the frustration very well. No. I mean, I know very well that in the Minnesota case we could have called upon expert testimony from several scholars, some of whom are in this room, okay? Expert testimony and being sources for reporters who are reporting on denialist campaigns, such as the reporting that was done about the Minnesota case, the Massachusetts case. We need good scholarship made accessible through the work of organizations like NAASR, which does a wonderful job on that, and through conferences like this. So I just want to draw a lot more attention to the middle ground, the actors there, what we need to be effective and how we depend on them. Thank you.
Thank you. We still have 15 minutes. There's two things. We either, there's two ways I'm going to stop. It's like either everybody just drops dead or something, or it's 6:30. So if you feel like it's that point, we can stop. If you have any questions, yes.
At the risk of saying something that's irrelevant to this conference, which is possible at 6:15, one of the questions that I have is that we've heard a lot about the need for accurate scholarship and communicating that scholarship out to the world, and I couldn't agree more. I teach writing, and I have taught writing at different levels, both at first-year levels, senior graduate school levels. And what I find with my students when they walk in the door, they're expected to get a freshman comp class where they're given critical thinking exercises and they're given assignments that are about themes, and they're supposed to come up with ideas. They're supposed to come up with ways to analyze information critically, and they're woefully terrible at it. And that course keeps getting offered. I'm sure most of you have seen courses like that where you teach and where you've gone to school. I did an experiment at one point. I was able to slide under the radar, and instead of doing that kind of course, I taught a course that actually asked people to tell stories about their lives. That course got people listening to each other far better than any kind of listening when they were trying to yell at each other or communicate with each other via what they call critical thinking. And I think to myself a lot about the situation that the Armenians have been in, trying to figure out how to get people to hear them, to listen to them. I was hearing a story that was told to me about the way a DA out in LA was trying to deal with the problem of the skinheads attacking Holocaust survivors' children. And what he decided to do out of sheer desperation was he put a group of people in the room, including grandparents and these young men that were terrorizing the neighborhood. And he said, talk to each other. And so this one old man looked up and said, why are you trying to kill my grandchildren? And that tended to break, it broke that wall. I don't know if this would work in different venues. What I do know is its story gets to people. And we have yet to find a media-savvy way of telling our story. Each time we tried to put on Musadak, for example, the Turks figure out a way to squash it. But it seems to me that there are other ways to use the media. Not that we don't need accurate scholarship, we do, and I thank everyone in this room for all the work that you've done, because I don't think we would be where we are now without it. I also think there's a second step, and that step is the emotional level, and I don't know that we've hit that yet.
Thank you. That?
Yeah. I'm not a lot of trouble with the whole discussion all day. It seems to me that we can argue about denying forever. But at any point in time, there are political realities that don't give a damn about what the moral issues are. So how do we change, how do we affect the political reality? How do we do that? It's obviously, the United States feels that Turkey is more important either than the diaspora or Armenia when it comes to the Armenian genocide. So how can we change that? What role would denial or fighting denial have in changing that reality? I don't have an answer.
I do, but I'm not going to give it to you. Okay, any other questions? We still have 10 minutes.
Haji?
Sorry.
Yeah, I've been attached to this thing for 12 hours, so so I need to separate myself. And so please bear with me. Richard Hovannisian talked about having to deviate from his work, his main work, scholarly work, and focus on the Armenian genocide because we are being driven to talk about this because of the denial. And also, Keith on the screen talked about the 3 months that he spent away from his work to deal with this issue. As Armenian Americans, we live with this, day in and day out. I mean, I do. I feel like my father was a survivor. It's so frustrating. The denial issue it actually becomes more of a force that I'm only now starting to study more about our culture, about our churches, our music, our art. I'm learning more about Alan Hovhannes and Khachaturian and things like that now, after the age of 50 into my 60s, because I started to study my father's story and I realized that this story needs to be told, brought to the schools, which I've done with others, and with Pam Steiner, but it's been driven more and more by the denial. That's been like the force that's pushed me in that direction, and I'm just now starting to try to learn to separate and focus on some of the beautiful culture of the Armenian heritage has. So that's it.
Mr. Aroyan, we all know that this is the case, that politics, their political realities and perceived state interests, but that does not mean that you're going to sit there and fold your hands and stop. You do the best you can. The denier arguments are used by governments that don't want to do anything or make excuses not to do anything. But you're raising a larger question, and that is, what can people with very limited resources, or a group with very limited resources, do against the, all that is there? You do the best you can. And I think they've done, compared with what their resources are, I think that those who support the reality of the Armenian genocide have done significant work and gained, on every level, from cities to counties to states, formal recognition, and increasingly inclusion of the genocidal experience within state curriculums. I know a few. So it hasn't been in vain. It's not in vain, but until you can persuade a government that its dealing with this issue is in its own interest, just as you can try to persuade the Turkish government that dealing with this issue in the end is better for itself. I mean, this is where Taner Akçam came from others came from, is that was saying, we're not doing this for the Armenians, we're doing it, so we can face ourselves. Now, we have a program here facing history and ourselves. And you can't really face the future, honestly, unless you can face yourself. And that's what some governments or people have done, not others. So I think your question is good, but in a way it is not directly relevant. It is relevant, but directly bearing on the need to deal with this issue of denial.
I was not advocating.
I know that. I know that.
Right. I think somehow, occasionally, we're focusing on the whole and not on the double.
Yeah.
And I just wish, given our limited resources, that we from time to time could do what we call strategic thinking.
Right.
At the political level.
Your name is?
Tim, yeah.
Tim. Let me go back to his comment. That is, you need allies. You need to join forces. The Jewish world is doing its thing, the Armenian world is trying to do its thing, the African world is trying to do its thing. But just imagine if you could bring all those groups together, then you have, people don't like that word, but it's true, political clout. And when you have political clout, then you can influence these kinds of things. And so up until now, at least, for whatever reasons, each one has its own reason probably, each one is interested only in its own and not in the broader one. And so that's why I appreciate today. I may have not understood everything, but I understood the fact that we're not just talking to one group about one issue, that is a specific issue, but the broader problem and broader issue that brings people from Burma and from Cambodia and from global warming and other things together with those of us who are most interested, let us say, in the Armenian genocide. And that's the way to go, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that and say that, much of the work that is done not because there's going to be an immediate reward, but in preparation for that opportunity at the moment. I don't think 10 years ago when more than 10 years ago when Tanner was writing his books and speaking about the genocide, right, people would have said, what, I mean, and I've heard this, right, I was a journalist back then in Lebanon, and people said, there's 70 million Turks. This is one guy. What are we going to do? But, now, well, yes, it's more than 70 million Turks, but it's not just one guy, right? And you can look at the donut or the whole, but the bottom line is that ultimately, when the opportunity presents itself, you need the scholarship to be there. You need the broader opinion to be there for you to be, and that's hopefully what we're trying to do. One final question. Who wants to be the last person to speak here?
I don't want to be the last person, but I do want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
And that is, I want to thank the organizers of this conference.
We can't hear you.
I want to thank the organizers of this conference for what I think for me is this genius idea of exactly what you just said, pulling together from these various, what seems completely disparate topics into a way that makes sense of this all together. I'd love to see more of that. I think we should work.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would like to thank you all for your patience and thank again all the organizers who made this event possible. Thanks to NAASR, thanks to Rutgers University, Clark University Strassler Center, Worcester State. Worcester State. Sorry. sorry. Thank you very much. Good night.
And you'll tell Deborah that we missed her.
Yeah.
Sorry.